We make sure we take our stakeholders with us, because this is very foreign. And if you think about the situation we're in, we've got boards saying you've got to make your numbers, you've got to get the sales, and the supply chain saying you don't understand my world. I've got stuff all over the place and I can't get it through ports. It's really tough. Can't find drivers to get things to me, etc. We need to make sure that we understand who the stakeholders are and make sure they are continue to be engaged all the way through this process. It's easier to think about a linear path of implementation, but there's always things that get in the way. I'm going to go through some of the notable ones I've seen happen in companies. Often leadership are afraid of doing it, because it's very different. We're used to the annual operating plan. It's simple. We sit down, we get the accountants to crunch some numbers, or do some Excel spreadsheets. They come out, everyone gets into negotiation. The deal is done, the budget is set, and off we go. This is different. It doesn't have such a well-defined timescale and pattern. And it also takes us into places and thought patterns that are quite challenging to people who are very tactically minded. Welcome, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Gary Newbury. I'm a senior executive on call, helping businesses in the make, move, sell flow of consumer goods and services. My purpose is to inspire business leaders, particularly those within the consumer products and retailing space, to think big, be bold, scale, adapt and win, one epic supply chain transformation at a time. There's additional content available through my website, RetailAID.ca, or on my YouTube channel, RetailAID. Be sure to check it out. As the business world faces much volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, organizations need to be tapping into resources with an inside edge on transitioning their teams to be agile, innovative, and digital, with thought leaders, experts, and senior executives who have mastery of operational turnarounds and strategic transformations to help reorientate their enterprises. There's great material to get through here, so let's get started.
This is our first PM in this 2021-2022 year. And we're starting with a great speaker actually today. I'm really glad he was able to make it today, because I know how knowledgeable he is. And I'm pretty sure everyone will learn something today from Gary, okay? So today's topic is strategic planning in an uncertain and volatile retail environment, okay? So as you read the communications, this is basically a networking. He will answer some questions, but it's mostly focused in everything that has happened in these past 20 months because of pandemic, the retail businesses, the suppliers and consumers, how the uncertainty has gone, and about the future as well. So it will be a pretty dynamic, but at the same time current topic, which we'll all benefit from. And to talk a bit about Gary, as I said, I'm pretty glad of having him today. So Gary helps boards, business leaders to become more agile, innovative, and digital across the make, move, sell flow of manufacturing, third-party logistics, wholesaling, retailing, and last mile. Specifically about Gary, he's a tough leader, facilitator, speaker, podcaster, as we spoke, trainer in the end-to-end retail supply chain and the last mile by many professional bodies, okay? He was awarded Supply Chain Canada's top 40 immigrants impacting on supply chains and recognized for his creative thinking via CITT's 2020 Innovator Award. Gary has been recognized as one of the Rethink Retail's top 100 global retail influencers in 2021. And he has a vast, huge education, MBAs, a bunch of certifications, and nonstop great experience in supply chain. So because of this, all his knowledge, experience, and everything that he brings to the table, more than happy of having him today as our first speaker of this year. And well, without further ado, thanks a lot, Gary, for being here today. It's really an honor to listen to you, to having you as our speaker. So thanks a lot.
During this session, there's some pretty serious materials to work through, but we have some fun along the way. I'm quite happy to take interactions, interventions during the presentation. There is quite a lot to get through. Now, you should see my first screen. We're going to talk about strategic planning in the degrees of uncertainty that we're currently facing. But although I've said retail, I don't want to exclude people and think, oh, I'm not in retail, I'm not in retail supply chain. It's really, if we scrub through retail and just go business, I'm hoping to make sure that you're fully engaged in this. I will apologise for my retail centricity though. So what we're going to do is look at a tool or an approach and methodology which can help retailers and other businesses just pick their way through this very challenging time. So Kerry suggested just grab bits from my bio, but I would describe myself as a senior exec on call, or in brackets, interim chief supply chain officer, who specialises in rapid performance improvement across retail supply chain to the last mile, the extended retail supply chain. I've been doing the kind of work I've been doing for more than 30 years. I've worked it across 50 companies, working on a whole range of typically mission critical assignments, which means it's normally finding that root cause of that performance gap may be. So my focus to stand in for somebody else is actually to work with the management teams to kind of work out where the source of their disruption has been. And typically it's been internal, such as a new system, maybe taking on a big new contract, everyone's patting themselves on the back, look what we've won. Within a month or two, it's fallen to pieces. And I've been asked to come in and understand what's gone on and then effect some strategy and execute that strategy to recover the situation. Oh, let me just ask you a question and to see if maybe if you want to write your answers in the chat, by all means, but I'm going to ask a little question beyond this. So is a business's supply chain adaptability, do you think it's key to creating a sustainable competitive advantage? I'm quite happy to, the answers are a dichotomy of yes or no. Most people suggest that it probably would be helpful if the supply chain was adaptable, was flexible, was responsive. My other question is, do we know what the actual purpose of a supply chain is? If we've joined the supply chain early in our career, we may just see just a small glimmer of what's going on. Maybe we land in a warehouse, we land in a transport fleet, we do something in inventory management, we might do demand planning. But I wonder if we ever thought about what's the purpose of this whole mechanism in terms of the business, and where does it sit? And particularly if you're in the retail supply chain, how important it is to deliver product to consumers, because I would argue this is the only process that really matters for a retailer, and particularly matters right now as we're in Q4, so we're heading into the peak period for most retailers. So this is my agenda. I'm going to do a little bit of scene setting. I might wander off in lots of different directions. I'm going to just reflect on the early stages and where we are broadly in the pandemic, and talk about a few planning approaches which have been tried and tested in the past, and just think about how they're not doing too much for us right now during this disruption where we can't rely on history. Talk about scenario planning and how we go about implementing that, and then we'll have a general discussion. So please jump in if you feel that I've undercovered something or said something which you don't quite understand. If you've got longer questions, we'll have some time at the end just to have a real good chat, I think, because as I say, there's quite a lot of material and it may be quite unfamiliar or quite challenging if you haven't seen this kind of approach before, and I want to encourage a discussion around that so you walk away with some value. I don't know about you guys, but back in March, April and May, I was reading article after article, listening to commentary after commentary, listening to podcast after podcast saying, trust me, I've been pivoting. And I wondered what that was at first. I thought that people were actually changing their business models. Now, a business model is actually a fundamental basis of which you drive profitability in your business. And when I thought about it, I started to think what they actually meant was, if we can imagine an operational capability or capacity, measured it across a continuum from this is where we are to this is what we could do with a few small additions. We were just moving up this thing, and suddenly we stopped making garments, we started making PPEs. Was that a pivot? Well, it was a kind of, if we believe that understanding, then pivot away all you like. But the way it was being expressed was often they were doing something fundamentally different in their business, something where the business model was pulled apart and reformed in a different way. Now, I put these two axes on the graph to illustrate the difficulty that we have and what we're trying to achieve in business terms. So on the y-axis down the left-hand side, we've got the actual ability to adapt to, for instance, disruption or some great big opportunity that we may derive from the scenario planning process. So ability to adapt is about having capabilities and capacities to step comfortably from where we are, the current business, to a new business or potentially a new business model. And we can actually pivot quite effectively at a low level of adaptability if the level of disruption is actually quite small. So for instance, if we had some disruption which was self-imposed, like we brought on a new contract and it wasn't working out very well, so we might actually bring somebody in with some talent to try and shape it up and try and get us on the right track again. Well, we could argue that was a pivot because it was a small addition to an existing operational capability. But as a disruption goes further from, say, internally self-injury to external, which like the pandemic, where the government's doing things that none of us probably expected to happen, we find our ability to adapt to these changes and actually make a good fist of it and try and get to a different place becomes incredibly restricted. And we find that at the high levels of disruption that many of us are facing in business, we find ourselves really quite constrained about how much flexibility we have in our design of our business and our design of our supply chains. So we often, halfway along that process, we actually come to a sort of moment of reality or a reality check. But what we're trying to get to is being able to be highly adaptive to a defined set of challenges in front of us. And I think that's really important when we talk about agility, because that's what I'm talking about. When we're trying to be agile, we actually have to make some investments to be able to move from today's model to tomorrow's model. And we need to be able to do that almost effortlessly, much like these gazelles are running across some place in a savannah, wherever it might be. So I just want to make that point, the difference between, and I'll come on to resiliency soon, because I think these terms seem to be interchangeable, and often it's because of a lack of understanding of what's trying to be achieved. We can pivot, we can be resilient, and we can be agile simultaneously, and I'm not sure if that's entirely true. So in terms of the pandemic, pre-pandemic, we really had a very easy task. We may have felt that it was really tough at the coal face, but reality was, for many years, we had a pretty steady, predictable growth rate. Often it was supported by, say, population. The population grows, our sales grow, more people buy stuff. And we knew where the peak was. And if we're in a typically seasonal retail businesses, around this time, Q4 is where most retailers will make something in the order of 65 to maybe even up to 85% of their gross margin will be made in this period. So it's really critical, seriously critical, that their supply chains actually work at this time to get stuff onto the shelf so we can make the sale. But the pandemic started to break that idea up, because what we saw was consumers changed their channel, they changed their categories they were spending their money on, and they changed the volume. So there was a lot of change, and a lot of the historic patterns that have been established maybe since the Great Recession, since we recovered from that, they've been fairly flat for a long time, and all of a sudden this happened, and everyone's rushing around saying, what's happening? How do we make sense of this? What do we buy next? So we have it on the shelves. What we've seen repeatedly in discussions with retailers is this concept of getting through. Just, if you cast your mind back to the first lockdown, we were told it was 2 weeks, don't worry, it's only 2 weeks lockdown. And it became another 2 weeks, and another 2 weeks. And that in March, I said, this thing's going to carry on until summer. And lo and behold, it did. We just about made it to, I think, Canada Day, around that, but we kind of opened up again. Most people didn't get that sense of how long this might be. But even then, I thought, this is over. We're going back to normal. So it was a bit of a struggle. Roll your sleeves up, come in, work harder, do more of it, whatever it was. And it was typically what you were doing in 2019. You were just doing more of it. And then we opened up, and then we went into another lockdown. And if we think we're 18, 19, 20 months into this chaos, and we haven't started to realize we need to adapt to this chaos, rather than just deal with it somehow with the traditional firefight, then I think we're missing a trick. And I'm going to just come on to this point here, which is around March, my coach, who I think might actually be on the call right now, he had we'd sort of formed a coaching relationship about 2 weeks before the pandemic hit. We had great plans for me to go and find a brilliant job, and he was laying out the path for me. And then we had this threat that we could lock down. He said, Gary, you need to go and talk to your supply chain chums and figure out what this means. And I said, well, I originally wrote it down and thought, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And I thought about that. I said, well, actually, it doesn't matter what I think. And even if I talk to the most experienced supply chain people in North America, it wouldn't change a job. What I actually need to do is talk to retailers, retail thought leaders, people who've been in retail for a long time, into executive appointments, running retail chains or advising retail chains across a wide range of categories. So I formed a group called 7 or 8 people. Many of them are well known in that space in Canada. And we sat down, we talked it through. I put my sort of 8 questions of, which I would have asked the supply chain guys, but I probably would have known the answers. So I asked them, and I asked them to write their responses, and they came back. And I said, don't worry, I'll write it all up, because I'm used to writing reports and stuff. And each of those questions had like so many different perspectives, but we ended up agreeing what retailers should be doing as a set of principles. And it was firstly, and this was in my mind at that time, we just had to do something once and we would get to a different place, we'd be over this, blah, 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 move on. But I'm going to come back to, there's a sort of nuance in this point, but the first stage of the transformation is to just do it, which meant that your whole focus as a business was in retail, get those shelves full, get that e-commerce site up and running, get it to take orders, get it to work, get the fulfillment process at work, get that last mile up and running, get Instacart involved, whatever it was. Just don't think about anything else. We've got to have sales. And if you're a non-essential retailer, it's even more pronounced, because if you hadn't got an e-commerce platform up and running, and maybe even if it was operating from stores, suddenly if you're in a discretionary spending category and you were in a closed mall, the mall was closed, you couldn't even access the stock. So you had to run around like frantically. You needed your best people, best firefighters to push that through. Alongside that, we should have grabbed some of the really clever people from IT, maybe supply chain and other parts of the business, and put them in a dark room and said, all these things that we've been going at on our digital transformation, pull them together, because these customers, our customers, are going to change, and they are changing. We don't know exactly which direction it's going to go into, but they're starting to shift their categories. Obviously, e-commerce, they're going to be using our e-commerce channel. and they're going to change their volume and their preferences. We may lose some customers, we may gain some other customers, but we need to develop capabilities. We need to have things that we can adapt as we become more aware of what our consumers are, what their desires are, as they spend more time in these restrictions and these lockdown situations. And the third step is once we get reopened, or I would argue we should have relaunched many retail brands, but they didn't. They slung their doors open and reopened and tried to get back to normal, except that there was hand sanitizers and masks and 6-foot markers and, you know, travel this way down the aisle. Of course, not many people actually followed those. So it was always quite intimidating inside stores for both staff and shoppers. But the third stage is to discard the old and pick up the new and adapt those capabilities. But more recently, I thought, well, in the overall scale of developing path to effectively a diversified strategy for your business, you normally go through continuous improvement, which I've always thought of as somewhat tinkering with today's world, kind of like the tactical things. Can we squeeze a bit of cost out of that? Can we do that a little bit better? Or can we get some more productivity out of how we organize the warehouse or the transportation, whatever it is? Then we had business transformation, which is typically a change to the business model, how we drive profitability into the business. And the extreme version of all this is reinvention. And I can say that reinvention is, for most retailers who absolutely desperately need to reinvent, all we have to do is go to most of your local retailers and you find that, you know, their formats, their look and feel, their atmosphere probably precede the Great Recession. So, you know, they're fairly stale and they need to do something fundamental to change their go-to-market strategy and their proposition. But I actually started to think that whereas continuous improvement was something we did all the time, I actually think transformation is something we're going to be doing all the time. So I'm not sure where continuous improvement sits in this anymore, but I know that continuous business transformation is something that we all need to get used to, because it's going to happen. And it's going to happen at an increasingly accelerated rate. Moving on to planning tools. As we were in 2019, we probably set great plans for 2020, 2021, you know, and the world was nice and smooth and even. We had a peak and we knew where it was and it could move around a little bit, and the volume could oscillate a little bit. But basically we knew what it was. And what we said when we budgeted on our annual operating plans, we'd say, what was it last year? Add on 5%. And then somebody would negotiate, well, I can't do more than 2%, boss. So, well, make it 3%, let's get on with it. And off we go, forecast and forecast and forecast. And you can just see the actual performance in the budget, hoping to converge at some point. And it was relatively predictable. It was tough at the cold face, I admit that. But in the overall scale of things, it was relatively a straightforward task. I don't know if anybody's actually done zero-based budgeting. I've had some exposure to it, but only as it was almost a token effort. It was like, what we're going to do is zero-based budgeting. We're going to go back to zero. And you have to come forward and justify every dollar and cent you're going to spend. And if you can't justify it, you're going to be wiped out because you're not value adding. Yes, that's the idea, but it doesn't actually work out quite like that. It's just a nice way of saying, we don't particularly care for this straightforward annual operating plan, kind of that plus a bit. What we want to do is actually get into the nitty-gritty, get into the engine room and see if we can shake things up, and maybe through that process do a little bit of re-engineering of both our costs, but more importantly our business process, to end up in a much better position. I'm going to just come on to current markets, current products planning, almost an extension of the first, but I've got a diagram behind this which might explain it a bit better. But generally speaking, imagine you had 10 years, 15 years of data, and it all showed you the same picture. Every year was almost a carbon copy of the previous year. So, you know, predicting into the future was, especially when it was aggregated, it was pretty straightforward. And then the pandemic happened and consumers moved around in terms of their aspirations, their expectations, their purchasing behaviors. And you can imagine that many companies struggle. We have to keep working to our plan, and suddenly your store was closed, your store network was closed because you're in enclosed malls. Oh, Yeah, but we've still got to stick to our plan. So we needed to find ways of thinking about this in a different way. Now, coming on to this product market matrix, you may have seen, if you've done any marketing studies in the past, you may have seen this type of representation. So I'm going to sort of lob something into this in a minute. But you have these two axes, and you have the current products or categories, and then new products or categories down the y-axis, and then across the bottom we've got current segments or current customers, if you like to call it that, and then new customers or new segments. Now, both of these are good things that we can move into. We can develop new products because we have more capabilities, or we can develop new markets because we have more capacity to deal with them, or more capabilities. But the toughest box is a diversification, where we're selling products we don't know right now to customers we don't know right now. So normally that would be a box of what most people would say pretty high risk. Staying where we are is pretty cool, because we think we know all the risks, and we've got a track record. We know our customers, we know our products, we know there's a relatively good match. But when we go to diversification, it is new products we don't know to customers we don't know yet. But I'm just going to bleed a little bit into resiliency. So resiliency is all about the current business, keeping it in good shape. It doesn't talk about moving out of that box. It says, I can take punches to the side and I'm resilient. I can recover from that fairly quickly because I understand my business. I understand how to, under pressure, I can make it do what I want it to do. I won't necessarily extend it by product or by market. And I think I've just touched on agility on the first graph in. You can see a company where it's resilient. You just look at some of the documentation. It's disaster recovery plan or business continuity plan. It's all about, we get this happen to us and we have to have a path to get back to normal. And that's a bit of a clue really in some ways, because I think most businesses just want to get back to normal. They're just 18 months into this, we just work harder and we try and get back to normal. And I think that's where we start to, once we've got that in our mind, we want to get back to normal, we start to ignore actual risks in the environment and therefore the opportunities which surround those risks. So I haven't really talked too much about forecast, but all I can say is that I think we probably might likely to agree on the fact that the forecast for 2019 for 2020, and even forecasts made in 2020 for 2021, would be pretty hopeless. People want to open up, they want to go back to normal, want to go back to that world where it was pretty linear, pretty consistent, and we knew what was going on. So I'm going to just talk about a general concept here, and that is the historic approach when we design supply chains. Well, there's a precursor to this. When we think about retailers and what I call the retail concept life cycle, imagine a product life cycle, but for a retailer, you have a period of startup growth, maturity or maturation, and you start to go down into decline. Now, many retailers coming to Canada, US, UK, tried to scale their proposition pretty fast. So they opened up more stores. They went for bigger stores, and then they pushed so much stuff into them. If you just look at the concept of Walmart, they've got hundreds, well, not hundreds, but we've got maybe 20 or 30 categories in a Walmart, jam-packed full of stock, big stores, especially the superstores, the 250,000 square foot superstores. That was the archetypal way to scale the business, is just to have more stuff for sale. Now, to support that, as we got to a point of diminishing returns, or even the retail concept was actually starting to show signs of decline, heading towards an axis where they go bust and don't exist as a banner anymore, the idea was we would find ways of taking costs out. We would have less people on the shop floor, and we would find cheaper sources of product. And in designing those supply chain networks, we would typically buy from China or somewhere in that area. We would buy it as cheap as we could, get onto the cheapest way of getting it to us, typically ocean, get it through the ports, get it onto a train, it's cheap, and get it to us. But unfortunately, we often found that, whereas when we were looking at a segment, we tended to be quite focused on minimizing that cost. But when we looked across the supply chain, I've got an important point to make here. When we look across the supply chain, we find that actually it's not optimized at all. It's optimized at individual logistic element, because nobody's looking at the whole picture typically. And that leads us to believe that if we sourced locally, we look at the invoices, and we look at the invoices potentially for that, and we say, well, local is going to be more expensive, isn't it? Because our cost models don't allow us to think more clearly about what problem we're trying to solve with our supply chain. And the problem that we're trying to solve with the supply chain is, how do we react to an emerging trend that has been demonstrated in a particular consumer segment? And if you're in apparel, you need to learn that very fast if you're going to get out in front of your competitors. What we currently have in apparel, for instance, is we have a guess, we put an assortment plan together, we project that into the future, and we say we're going to concentrate all our purchasing power into one factory, and probably our competitors also use that factory, so there's a potential bottleneck. We send an order over, maybe a whole season. It may be 6 months hence, we give you 6 months worth of orders, and we just sit there and pray that our style, cuts, sizes, colors, we've picked it right, because as soon as it's made, there's no postponement. It's done. And it comes over, it gets into a container, not very lean, because basically to be lean, you have to understand what single piece processing is. So you accumulate it by container. You may have to have several containers before it goes to the port, gets on a boat, but it doesn't go on a boat. It has to wait for all the other all the other containers to be loaded, gets across the ocean. On a good day, you get onto the port, you get unloaded. Right now, it's probably about 3 or 4 weeks just waiting to be unloaded, especially if you're going to American ports. But the issue for me is that the local option is a very difficult concept, because many of the skills that we used to have, we used to make things here, those skills have been frittered away. They've been undervalued, and people have gone into other things, or found other sources of income. So for us to think about local, we have to really start thinking big about the kind of investments we need to make in our local supply chain, which may include spending capital developing those capabilities of, if you're in apparel, sewing and garment fabrication. Now, I'm conscious of time. I haven't had any questions yet because nobody's interrupted me, but I want to talk about what I think about the supply chain. It's best that I'm going to ask a colleague called Jim Tompkins just to give us 10 minutes on what he means by optionality rather than optimality. For historically, we've always done optimization. You'll hear that. Oh, I'm doing route optimization. I'm doing pick path optimization. It's all about sort of tactical analysis of this thing that we're just about to do. How can we do it better, without the basic strategic framework to say, are we doing the right thing here? Should we be doing this? How then can we organize ourselves for much more flexibility?
Hello, my name is Jim Tompkins, and I'm the CEO of Tompkins International. It is very important that we chat today, because I believe these are the most uncertain and volatile times in the history of the world. Uncertainty and volatility make it impossible to make accurate predictions about the future, or to define operating requirements of what we need to be doing over the next several years. Uncertainty and volatility result from the digital era, from the disruption cycle, the global economy, the innovations from technology, entrepreneurship, robotics, data science, commerce in general, and new retail, as well as from politics, bankruptcies, and mergers and acquisitions. Many executives are frustrated and troubled by the level of uncertainty and volatility, but this provides no relief. Today's reality is that uncertainty and volatility are not going away. And instead of being frustrated, we need to learn how to succeed and flourish in these uncertain and volatile times. This is why I'm speaking to you today to answer how to succeed and flourish in these uncertain and volatile times. In one word, the answer to this question is anti-brittle. So let's start there. What is anti-brittle? One, anti-brittle is the opposite of brittle. When you drop a plate on a kitchen floor, since the plate is brittle, it breaks. It shatters into 1,000 pieces. Two, due to the flexibility, the modularity, the agility, the adaptability, the anti-brittle lives on for another day. Three, another way to think about anti-brittle is to think about anti-brittle decisions as solutions where you have no regrets. When no regrets decisions are decisions that you feel good about, where you're confident that the decision is right and the decision will not come back to haunt you. Four, anti-brittle businesses operate efficiently and effectively over a wide range of requirements. But even more, anti-brittle solutions are solutions that are not static, dead, or steady state, but rather are dynamic living organisms that are alive and capable of responding to stimuli, reproducing, growing, developing, and evolving over time. In business today, it is very difficult to understand the difference between traditional organizations versus anti-brittle organizations. A traditional organization is designed to achieve stability via a static, siloed, hierarchical structure. Traditional organizations operate using linear planning and control. The structure is strong, methodical, and deliberate, but unfortunately slow and brittle. Traditional organizations work well in stable environments, but in times of high uncertainty and volatility, they crash and burn. Traditional organizations have not worked well since 2015, and they will not work well into the future. Simply too much uncertainty and volatility. Anti-brittle organizations are a network of connected teams that operate with rapid learning and fast decision cycles. Anti-brittle organizations have the ability to quickly and efficiently reconfigure. Anti-brittle organizations are flexible, modular, portable, agile, and scalable. They experiment, make mistakes, and move from failure to success quickly. Anti-brittle organizations make no regret decisions, and they operate well by evolving over a series of options that morph into what is needed over time. Anti-brittle organizations have no steady state, rather an ongoing evolution of options. In today's dynamic, uncertain, volatile environment, we need solutions that are anti-brittle and no regrets, enduring to last well into the future and to evolve past the volatility, uncertainty, and unpredictability of the day by easily moving through options that allow for a series of optimal solutions to be deployed over time. The series of optimal solutions begets the question, should we be trying to establish optimal solutions, or should we be developing solutions that offer us a series of optional solutions, allowing us to adapt over time to the circumstances that occur? The fact is that traditional organizations pursue optimality, whereas anti-brittle organizations pursue optionality. We see with anti-brittle solutions, the more options presented, the less brittle, and thus the more anti-brittle. Especially in times like today of high volatility, you need even more options. Optimality is broken in volatile times, whereas optionality is no regrets. It is winning in volatile times. In fact, given the volatility, uncertainty, and unpredictability of the day, I believe optionality is optimal. A key with respect to properly deploying options is that the easier, quicker, and cheaper to deploy options, the more anti-brittle and the better the results. A frequent challenge, after a brief explanation of anti-brittle, has to do with the application of optionality. I have found by presenting an example of optionality, I am able to move the understanding of anti-brittle from basic to advanced and from theoretical to practical. Let me use the challenge of new retail to illustrate optionality. New retail is when brands and retailers understand that it is not about bricks versus clicks, but rather bricks and clicks. New retail is when brands and retailers understand that it is not about private labels versus brand, but but it's about private label and brands. The facts are, in today's world of new retail, all firms must sell in-store and online, and all retailers must do private label, and all brands must do direct-to-consumer. Today's uncertainty and volatility in the new retail is a result of, one, ongoing changes in consumer expectations and shopping preferences. Two, ongoing expansion of where, what, and how retailers and brands offer products to consumers. Three, ongoing changes in consumer desires for services, prices, selection, experience, and convenience. In the last few years, consumers have gone from, one, buying what the retailer had to sell versus buying exactly what they want. Two, paying for home delivery versus expecting free shipping as well as free returns. Three, expecting delivery to their homes in 5 days, to 4 days, to 3 days, to 2 days, versus today, in many situations, next day or same day. Four, shopping in stores versus wanting more buy online, pick up in store. Five, going to stores to shop versus going to stores to be pampered and entertained. And six, an ongoing list of never-ending changes. And into this hurricane wanders the supply chain team, who is asked to do a 5-year network design to decide where to locate their wholesale warehouses, their retail distribution centers, and their direct-to-consumer fulfillment centers. Of course, the process for doing a network design is well known, but the truth is it is impossible to define the requirements of the supply chain network for the next 3 years, let alone the next 5 years. With consumer expectations and the company's expectations varying tremendously, and with today's uncertainty and volatility, there is nothing known about a 5-year planning horizon. Nevertheless, the supply chain teams work hard, and after many months of wrangling, there is an agreement on the base data, and after 3 months of network and sensitivity analysis and 2 months of facilities design, a 5-year plan and capital request is presented to the board. The capital request is denied by the board for many good reasons, and the supply chain team is told the board does not agree with the data set and the requirements, so they are told not to deploy their plan, but rather to move forward with a 3PL solution. The supply chain team moves forward, but the 3PL requests the same requirements that already have decided were too uncertain to rely upon. But there is no choice, as the firm really is out of capacity. So they do a 3PL contract for 3 years, knowing full well the requirements are poorly defined, and the 3PL does the best they can do. But what results is a manual solution using existing technologies. All parties are disappointed, performance is bad, costs are high, and service is poor. So management decides to hire a supply chain consultant to fix this mess. Unfortunately, although the consultants do a fine job, they cannot define the requirements, and so they too fail. So what is the best answer to this? It is not having a better internal supply chain or hiring a better supply chain consultant. The answer is to realize it is important to define the requirements, but it is impossible to define the requirements. What is needed is not an optimal network designed on poorly defined requirements, but rather an anti-brittle solution that allows transitioning from option to option as the requirements evolve.
You can find them on YouTube. This was done in June 2019. The message that he's suggesting resonates very clearly with where we are right now. The next 3 or 4 minutes is more of a, how would say, a sales pitch to T-sort micro-fulfillment equipment. The advantage with his is, with Tompkins, is they can be put in place, they can work, and when you want to change your mind, you literally lift them up, unlike some micro-fulfillment centers in more traditional formats where it's a racked situation. This is a kind of flow rack, T-sort system, a normal kind of miniaturized warehouse, which takes quite a lot of civil to establish. And if you want to move this around, you have to disassemble it, and it's a big job. So hopefully you picked up some of the essence, so you could explain it a lot better than I can. moving on to scenario planning, which is what I've come to talk about, but I wanted to set some general scenes and just bring us all up to date. I'm going to walk through at a fairly brisk pace now because I'm conscious of time and I don't want to overrun on my presentation, although I'm quite happy to talk beyond that around any questions.
We have two questions in the chat too when you're ready for them.
Okay, I'm quite happy if they're short. I can sort of...
Does technology provide the necessary flexibility and efficiency at the same time as the optionality?
I could give quite a detailed answer, but in simple terms, I think that we can look at technology and think that's the solution. And I always say we must look at process first and then see how the technology can be implemented to speed that process up. But we start with process first and then the technology comes along for the ride. I don't know if that helps the clarification, but you derive efficiencies typically from the design of process. The technology just makes it a lot faster or a lot more visible or a lot more in control.
And then the second one was, so would you consider continuous improvement that moves the goalposts of business goals a hybrid of optionality?
That's an interesting one. My first thought of that question, we can discuss it perhaps in the Q&A, but my first thought, continuous improvement and solutions like micro-fulfillment centers are probably incompatible. They're not even in the same school of thought, I think, because continuous improvement is looking at an existing operation and not making step changes, but making incremental changes. Whereas if you're going from, we haven't got a way of handling e-commerce. Oh, yes, we've got a website now. We need a micro-fulfillment center to put stuff into it. There it goes. And part of the solution design is actually working out what are best practices, because this will typically be a brand new installation, brand new process or brand new way of looking at the world. We will try and embed as many best practices into the design of the micro-fulfillment center, switch it on, maybe make some tinkering to it. Some things weren't properly understood and we have to work on that in real time, and then it will work. And the next step would be to say, beyond that, it's very hard to imagine a lot of continuous improvement onto a micro-fulfillment center. You'd be saying that the challenge would be, how do we seriously ramp up this performance? Could it be by adding modules? Could it be by adding a different type of micro-fulfillment center? Or if we're looking at the inbound and outbound of that, can we induct it in a better way? These are more fundamental questions. But when you're talking about the speed of blue totes moving around the thing, that would be typically set by a combination of a WCS and the system design.
Thank you for that.
Okay.
So on to scenario planning.
Yes, let's go. So I'm going to kind of whiz through this because I think what I've said so far, positioning ourselves, Jim's recording, is actually quite powerful. Bearing in mind that was done pre-pandemic, it resonates now. But the process of scenario planning is we must identify the key business risks. It's something that most leadership teams kind of dodge around. They kind of know, we know our business, and someone says, well, have you thought about this? Oh, you're just a troublemaker. That's me, actually. I know that role. So we really must understand the key business risks. Where are those risks? Where they're coming from? And I'm going to go through a bit more detail on this in a minute. From that, the next stage is to create multiple bold futures or scenarios. A scenario isn't a what if, like you do on an Excel spreadsheet, where you might even be more sophisticated and try and do on AI. This is actually looking at the world and just going, if that happens, what does our world look like? And what's the risk that's created that? And where's a big opportunity? And looking at that matrix, that product, market, and diversification, where can we move on that box that's in a better place than we are now when that risk starts to actually turn into an issue? Then we have to schedule requirements, and I'll go into this in more detail. Then we have to prioritize, because we can't have infinite bold futures. If you see what's going to happen next, you'll see that there's a huge amount of work that's involved underpinning this. But we have to prioritize them, and also what are the triggers which would make us invest even more than we have done, so that when that risk moves into an issue, we've already moved down the path of investing ahead of that, so that when that manifests itself as a clear issue, we just move and it's no massive firefight. And then develop common platform requirements. Jim wasn't going down that direction, but I'm saying that if we are envisaging a small number ideally, of these different scenarios, that we need to make sure that our warehouse is capable of moving whichever way that wind blows, that we've got capabilities and capacities to accommodate that in our transport fleet, in our warehousing, and how we approach inventory, how we approach our store networks, how we look at merchandise, and how we market ourselves. All these things are all part of this puzzle. And guess what? We have to invest. We can't just say, write it down, and that's our mitigation plan. That's our plan B. It's on the shelf. Because we've had that, and it didn't work. The pandemic came, everyone's had well, pretty much most companies will have a business continuity plan to deal with pandemics. They pulled them out. What do we do around here? This is irrelevant. We thought we knew what we were talking about, a pandemic. Nobody knew the government was going to lock us down. There's a process that's never, well, the last time it was done is something like 1400 AD. So we're going to go into a little bit of Checkin Requirements, because this isn't a light exercise. This is not scenario planning light, and you can get to the point of agility. You have to work through this process. If you've had a marketing exposure elective, maybe in a course, you'll start to see some familiarity here. There's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis, both current, where do we sit here with that potential bold new future, and where would we desire to be within that marketplace or that product market combination. And then we look at what used to be 6 factors, but I think that I'm going to raise another issue here. But you've got the political, environmental, societal, technological, legal, economic, and activism. Now we might think, why is that on that page? And I'll give you a direct example. In the UK, they're sitting on something like 120 years worth of shale gas reserves. They could be energy secure for that length of time, to allow them to develop the green technologies or whatever it might be that allows them to be much more self-sufficient off of effectively fossil fuels. But activism, a small group of people said, well, that's really bad, it's bad for our environment, stop it. So we're now in energy crisis in the UK. If you've been following reports that people are queuing up at gas stations for 6 hours to top up their tank, a ridiculous thing. But it shows you how insecure the energy situation is, and we know that unless we have energy, pretty much our economy can crash very quickly. Then we develop a business plan for each of these potential bold new futures. We have to develop a full business plan, and we list the capacities and capabilities that are required to support that position in the market with these products, these segments. And then we have to rank the profitability of all these different scenarios, because we have to cram it down to something we can work with and actually deliver, because we could have 15. But you imagine doing all this work and the capital expenditure plan, which would allow you to do a huge amount of variation. I mean, you're talking about massive expansion of the warehousing network capabilities and transport fleet, etc. We have to identify the trigger event. If we're looking at risks, we'll have a continuum of where we think that risk, how that risk will develop into an issue. And we have to say, at what point do we move on with our investment plans so that when it develops into an issue, we can just dodge it and come over here. So in terms of implementing the scenario planning, 5 steps here. We have to assess our ability in the past to 1, identify key risks, 2, to plan for them, and 3, to execute a known strategy. And I think that, not asking you to look at your own business, but you might want to just reflect on that and say, how many times has something just turned into an issue that could have been mitigated much earlier and been avoided? One might argue there's some motivation that we deal with issues so that we can go out and firefight these things, and there's often rewards and recognition around firefighting than actually planning things out so that they don't occur. The ability to firefight is probably a measure of our inability to adapt effectively. We were just running around hoping that somehow something's going to go right here and we're going to land in a better place. We need to engage our stakeholders, because scenario planning is actually a very different way of managing the future. We need to identify them. I'm going to again come back to who are stakeholders and how do we manage them. We're going to have to create some business specific templates, so we work out how do we record all this stuff, and we can design some of those business templates to allow the data to be collected correctly, or at least consistently. And then we conduct the scenario planning process of all futures, the checkin requirements, etc. And then we make sure that we take our stakeholders with us, because this is very foreign. And if you think about the situation we're in, we've got boards saying you've got to make your numbers, you've got to get the sales, and the supply chain saying you don't understand my world. I've got stuff all over the place and I can't get it through ports. It's really tough. Can't find drivers to get things to me, etc. But we need to make sure that we understand who the stakeholders are and make sure they are continue to be engaged all the way through this process. Now, experience tells you everything. Roadblocks. I'm sure I haven't included all of them here, but what gets in the way? I mean, it's easier to think about a linear path of implementation, but there's always things that get in the way. And I'm just going to go through some of the notable ones that I've either bumped into or seen it actually happen in other companies. So often leadership are afraid of doing it, because it's very different. You know, we're used to the annual operating plan. It's simple. We sit down, we get the accountants to crunch some numbers or do some Excel spreadsheets. They come out, everyone gets into negotiation. The deal is done, the budget is set, and off we go. This is different. It doesn't have such a well-defined timescale and pattern. And it also takes us into places and thought patterns that are quite challenging to people who are very tactically minded. They sometimes fear the unknown, and often there's a technical skill gap here. How do you actually perform a proper strengths, weaknesses, opportunities threat with all the seven items of that I mentioned in the previous slide? Hierarchical pressures. Often the CEO has been brought in, he or she will have liaised with the board, say, I've got the vision, I've articulated it to you, and now I'm going to articulate it to my team and get everybody bought into this. Oh, there's a pandemic. I'm still sticking to it. That's what I've been brought in to do. Scenario planning is actually saying, we may have to change your mind. And it does take quite a lot of strength of character of whoever's coordinating this process to say, where you've come from is great and it worked pre-pandemic, but we're in a pandemic. These are the things that are going on. These are the risks. These are the bold new features we can do. Here's the route to profitability. And we need to stop that and think about these. It does require a considerable amount of objectivity, because if you have worked with executive colleagues, you'll find that they don't always share the same norms and expectations. They tend to be quite functionally aware, functionally driven, and often there's this joining piece, which should be the executive team, the C-suite, whatever you like to call it, don't always actually behave as if they're joined up thinking it's being used. So you need to do scenario planning effectively. It's always best to have somebody who's sitting there, who's objective, and that can be often done by somebody coming in and doing that. It is a step change in terms of understanding. It's a bit like, your laundry machine goes off. You could fix it, but you'd have to learn all the codes, read all the books, and try and get the right wrench and dig it through. Or you can just get a plumber in just to sort that out, put it back, and it's off and running again. And similarly with scenario planning, it's not different in that point of concept. We have a number of silo-driven planning tools. We have a new warehouse management system. It does this X, Y, and Z. We may have even some AI attached to it, and it predicts a number of things. This isn't going to help you to look at the future. It's going to help you to look at your today's task, maybe even next week's task in terms of scheduling staff and whatever it might be. But we're talking about, a 2, 3, 4, 5-year vision ahead. And to being able to look at that and see what we need to do to invest in certain capabilities and capacities to allow us to move from one situation, a current business model, to an extension from that. And this is a really interesting one, because people who have been brought up on a sweat the assets philosophy, it's got to have an ROI. I've got to know exactly how this is going to work out. It's got to have I's dotted and T's crossed. It's got to be laid out for me. It's got to be perfect. I've got to know exactly how to do this. This is a very different world, scenario planning, and also saying we're going to invest in, we might spend 2, 3 million, 5 million, who knows? We don't know what the answer might be. But we're not going to get an immediate return on this. But you can bet your bottom dollar that maybe in 2 or 3 years' time, we will be so pleased we made that investment that something will happen in our environment, something we're tracking, and just before it becomes an issue, we switch. We've already made most of the investment. We just need to polish off the last bit, the adaptation of the capability. We're in the market, and we may be way ahead of our potential competitors, and we have the opportunity then to get potentially supernormal profit from that decision that was made maybe 2 years ago. So background work, which I'm going to run through this fast. So this is all about stakeholder engagement. But basically, if you've done project management before, the first thing, if you've done the PMP, one of the first boxes you bump into is, who are your stakeholders and how are you going to manage them during a program of change or a project? So we need to identify who they are, classify them. Sometimes we may want to put them in groups of similar behaviors, and the behaviors are either they're going to be supporting the project or going to get in the way of a project, or could be indifferent towards it. You need to keep them informed, because they may have a say in the future. We need to develop communication plans for each one of those groups or each one of those individuals, how we're going to communicate to them. As we run through this, and there'll be things that disrupt the process, what is the method that we're going to share that information with each of those individual or groups of stakeholders? We need to deliver that message in a consistent, positive, confident way. And we need to monitor change in the agenda, so that somebody who was sitting in the warehouse very up for this kind of a project suddenly moves to merchandising. They have a completely different view on this, and they now throw in their clogs in the machine. They really have turned into really anti the project. So we need to be very mindful of changes in the organizational structure, people moving from different departments and inheriting different agendas. So in terms of delivering the project from a project management point of view or from a stakeholder point of view, we typically will have a kick-off meeting where we explore what is scenario plan, what's the aim of this, where we're trying to get to, what the benefits of working in this way, the approach, the methodology, and also what is a work plan, the rough timescales, because we can only do it roughly, because we haven't got, this isn't a regular sort of annual process. It's a process which you may repeat infrequently. You take them through the bold future evaluations and the analysis, so that you keep them on board. You had 10, but you reduced it to 3, and this is a componentry of those 3 bold new futures, and what might be involved, what are the risks involved, what are the trigger points, and how we would respond to those trigger points. Then you have to say, we need some funding for all this, don't we? And by that stage, they should hopefully broadly agree with the principle that we may need a number of millions to invest in today's equipment to enhance it, so we can move to a different place on that matrix. And then regular updates on how we're doing, and also on the risks and triggers. How those risks, are they still relevant? Are we still moving on that continuum to the point, we're still aiming for the same point where we make the final piece of investment, the final adaptation? I'm going to skip over this. When I've run this presentation before, actually throughout a number of risks and ask people to look at it, and then we sit around and discuss it. But I'm going to skip forward because I'm conscious of time and I want to have enough time for people to ask questions and perhaps inquire into this. But if you want to explore further, I'm more than happy to have a follow-on conversation to either, go through a step guide in how to scenario plan in a bit more detail, or to work with you on uncovering risks that the business doesn't see so easily, or to develop a work plan to work collaboratively on establishing a scenario planning approach to your future. But it's not a sales pitch, it's just what I do. So here's my contact details. I did say before, I think we opened up the call, I've got my own YouTube channel, which is RetailAID, or one string, but there's two podcast channels I'm on formally. One is The Business of Retail. We've got something like 26 episodes and we're just launching a new format. If you go into that website, you can see all the things. The last formal episode we did was, weirdly, the supply chain, because it's finally grown in popularity even within the group of retail experts. I've finally got them to talk about the supply chain. It's called Wake Up and Smell the Supply Chain. And that has David Ian Gray, George Menakakis, Craig Passon. If you're in the retail world, he runs Retail Insider, and Christine Cowan, background in Nike and Adidas on the merchandising and product creation side. And my other YouTube channel, podcast channel, is with Lisa Amlani, who's a merchandiser in the whole area of luxury and fashion. Me and her just have very short conversations, but we dive all over the world of retail, and we're quite rambunctious in our conversations. And we're developing a new series which talks about the product journey and the segments that are involved. And it's really clear if you follow it through. We've yet to actually do the recordings, but retailers need to kind of a bit of a shake up in their organizations, because some of the things that are really supply chain are stuck in merchandising, and it's a real muddle. But we're trying to make it clear for people, how do you get from a design, the conceptualization, all the way through to people's porches? What are all those steps involved? We're going to talk about the nitty gritty of it, and also talk about, pose some question. Well, what if we could do this? And just let people think that one through for themselves. So that's the end of what I've got to say today. But I'm sure that if there are questions, I'll carry on talking for quite some time. I did finish on time. Brilliant.
Still time for 1 minute for questions. Denise, are you?
I'm here.
Excellent.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay. Gary, thank you. Thank you, ASCM, for having a joint effort for the CITD Toronto Area Council. I think we got the word out a little too late to gain some interest and have some extras on board, but I'm excited to see where we can go in the future in terms of getting our groups together to network. Gary, always interesting. Great job as usual. Love the podcast as well. All the accolades, you deserve them. So great job as always. But yes, thank you everybody for having us tonight.
Thank you, Denise. Very encouraging words, very kind. Thank you.
Thank you. So I would love if we could still do Q&A, but I recognize that some people do have a hard stop at 8 o'clock.
Yep.
So I thought this way, if you are able to stay on and cover some Q&A.
Yeah, I'm up for it.
Excellent. Chris, did you want to say your question, or do you want me to read it for you?
But not Chris Jarvis.
Hey Gary, good to see you, man. Yeah, great job as usual. I'm always interested in listening to what you have to say and how you think about these problems. I mean, as someone who works in startup, I kind of live my life most days in disruption and in a place of having to try to change people's agendas, right? I guess for me, it's like in the model, it's pretty rigorous in the thought process that we go through, but where do you see creative thinking coming into that? How do you view an innovation agenda? How realistic is it for large enterprises to contend with out of the box type ideas? The work that I do, it's sometimes like you have to wipe a clean slate and start again. to get past where you're going.
You're right to raise these things because these are fundamental. I mean, I think it's George Mamikakis said and I keep repeating it on LinkedIn, it's competitors are not the enemy, which is a bit profound in itself. The inability to innovate and create trends is. If you fail as a business to realize your agenda is to take your consumers on a journey to get ahead of their needs, you can't do it, as Jim was saying in his, in that diagram with the steps and sort of linear. If you think that way, ultimately you're not going to meet your consumers' expectations, aspirations. If that steps becomes like this, chances are you probably are. You're trying to follow or get ahead. Always think about design thinking, which it sounds very sophisticated. Design thinking, you just bang something up, and you actually get the customer in, say, test that to destruction. Is that something you're interested in? And you prototype something. You say, well, actually, let's take it back to yours and paint it red. Is that any good? And it sounds like almost quite a trivial process, but it isn't. It's fundamental because you're actually interacting directly. You're not looking at data and going, oh, look at these meaningful insights. We're actually talking to a customer or a group of customers to understand how we can better fit our capabilities, our products to their actual needs, and also get a development path. Say, if we give you this, what would you do next? What would your next need be? And moving down that path. That for me is an ongoing process. I think that companies might think of innovation, and like I'm saying about scenario planning, it tends to be a kind of a step, and then we kind of monitor it. Whereas design thinking and the process around innovation should be a pretty ongoing process. You are looking at data to give you some ideas, but those ideas should be then developed into concepts, products, for instance, and then tested directly with customers. And that should be ongoing. There should be no September, oh, that's innovation month, let's do it.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. And I think your earlier point to contend with an innovation agenda and be that leader is where the challenge is today. I think it's about leadership. And I think it's fundamentally gaps between technology. But anyway.
Yeah, well, you raise an interesting point there. So as you trigger me into thinking, the worst thing I believe a retailer can do, or any other business can do, and I'm being quite contentious now because it's running against the grain, is having an innovation lab that's totally detached from a business, sitting in some ivory tower in head office, with folk who are actually interacting with the customer, looking at the merchandise being dumped onto the floor and going, we're never going to sell that. We know our customers, they ain't going to take that dress or whatever it is. They're normally dissociated away from the innovation. It's like really clever people in the innovation lab because they've maybe have great qualifications, but they don't know how to understand the customer. They can understand technology and develop that. That's great, but understand the actual need that they're trying to fulfill. That's I think during my time at GFS, they introduced an innovation lab. I have no idea how it survived, but it was oh, that's what I think they said. That's what Amazon are doing, so we better do it. It's like, no, innovation is in your business already. You just haven't embraced it and developed a process by which you take really information and be able to convert that into a clear set of needs or specifications, and then how to deliver against that. Thanks, Chris. Great question. Have you got any more?
I'm happy to talk all night.
Yeah, I know. I know last time.
The dangerous part of putting the two of you in the same room.
Last time he's put me under so much pressure to ask questions. So what's your next question, Gary?
Anybody else with a question? I love the terminology of optionality. I really do think that's a great way of describing it. Have you seen any retailers that are actually good at doing this?
Not yet. I see lots of people having a go at things. Like when I think about Loblaws, which is, for people who don't know, is our largest Canadian-based retailer, they've got lots of things going on, but I only get snippets of it. And I think, I'm not sure how this all comes together. They were trialing a middle mile solution. So something that delivers from the DC to the store. It was autonomous. I don't know if they actually had a driver in it, or I just trusted that, you know, going through the streets of Toronto, this wouldn't kill people. But they did that. That's brilliant. And they've done some other things. But then I'm looking and just going, is this it? Like, have they got, I don't know how many people, 10,000 people looking at the broad area of how to improve the business? And I would have thought I'd have seen some real glimmers of great hope here, but I don't see it. And I continue to look at other retailers, and they do small things. I can't see the picture. I can't see the journey they're on, except that somebody may have said to them, we need to do something, anything, or PDSA, please do something or anything. And so people go off and kind of tinker, and there doesn't seem to be an overall scheme that you can see and you can follow and you take an interest in, you want to engage in, you want to go and support that retailer on that journey. They're doing something new and it's great and exciting. Let me buy some stuff from you. It's like, I'm doing this bit here.
I'll just second what you said, Amy. I think optionality is where innovation comes from, right? It's not an either or. It's, I want my cake and eat it too. I want it all. So I want the convenience, I want the speed, and yes, I want it ecologically friendly, and you just keep going through that to figure out what's it going to take to have it all. So, you know, we're in the business of returns, and so the answer is not to turn off e-commerce. I guess you could solve e-commerce returns if you just evaporated e-commerce. Well, that's not going to happen. So how do we fix e-commerce returns? Well, you start drilling into that deeply. And I think for large organizations, I think it's a little bit of ADD, maybe, Gary. It's how do I get the focus on the right elements of the business? Where are the real pain points? And I think I see retailers trying a lot of stuff nowadays. There's concept A and concept B and store format Z, and there's all this stuff going on, but it's like, does anybody truly have a point of view? To your words, you know, that bold future, are we looking to a North Star, or are we just randomly shooting arrows in different directions to see what sticks? And I think behind all that is, you know, a great deal of deep thinking and a whole bunch of leadership to allow some of that to percolate, to let people explore efficiently problems of the day. And I keep bringing it back to returns because that's the problem I'm on right now. Is it's been around since the dawn of retailing, but yet has anybody truly fixed returns? Like, it's been with us from day one of e-commerce, and it's getting worse. It's difficult to solve for sure, but it doesn't mean we don't have to solve it. We just need to have focus, and we need to think about it differently. I would offer up, in thinking about it differently, at least today, I would talk about, you know, shared assets, right? You know, we try to optimize assets, and it's my truck and my store and my employee and my stuff and me. And I think the new world needs to be about shared economies, leverage, networks that are serving multiple people. And if we got out of this mindset of my system and my tech and my conveyor belt, and we got into, you know, the network and the utility of the network, I think we find completely different resolutions to really big problems. And, you know, for me, on what I'm working on, returns is about a shared network. And if 400 retailers all think they're going to solve e-commerce returns and buy their own 7-figure systems, we're going to be here for the next 5 years, and there's going to be a lot of retailers out of business. So I think we need to start being a little more, it's a mindset, and I think it requires a great deal of leadership to instill it.
Yeah, I think we try and start to solve the returns process or the problem, because it is a problem, isn't it? But we start to solve it initially internally, because if you think about, and we talked about this on the podcast that we did, and you should go and see it, everybody. It's brilliant. He's brilliant. I was just there as wallpaper.
Yeah, don't get me started talking, right? Like,
no, stop. It's, if we think about returns in particularly retailers, we don't actually have any functional responsibility for them. We have people in stores, people in merchandising, people on the digital marketing team, people who look after e-commerce fulfillment if it's not in the store. And all that happens, although it's highly siloed, people kind of get a picture of that. But when it comes to returns, we've always had returns in retail. typically in a store-based sale, maybe somewhere between 8 and 10 is a general level of returns. And there's normally a fairly clear process. You go and turn up the surly customer service, use that customer service person, you've used this, haven't you? And you have to negotiate, and you finally, put your pristine product in front of them, which is absolutely still in the cellophane still around it. And you think you've used this, sir. And you get your refund and you go off. When it comes to e-commerce, it's a bit more difficult. But even with stores, nobody's responsible for returns. There's no, like there is a chief supply chain officer, it may be part of their responsibility. With a chief finance officer, it might be part of their responsibility. For merchandiser, it might be part of their interest area. So nobody really owns it. As a retailer, you have to actually identify this is a problem and actually allocate somebody to it with the authority to make changes. And to what Chris has said is to engage in a solution. And the solution may not be straightforward. It may not be, oh, don't worry, I'll pick it up myself, or get DHL to do it. And to actually think about, as Chris has mentioned, to think about the use of shared networks. And as soon as we start thinking that way, we may actually start thinking about the outbound side. Because when me and Chris had our last chat here, I come from an asset-based background, so I ran one of the largest fleets out in the UK for home delivery, and Chris was trying to challenge me, and he did challenge me, frankly. And I'm used to running trucks and drivers and knowing the mechanics of that, even in the union, non-union situation. But the thought of having all that capital investment when there could be a better solution, more flexible, more responsive solution, it started to make me think, well, I thought I was flexible. I thought I was responsive. I had these blokes and they went out and collected, drove miles and delivered stuff and collected loads of stuff. And we were already there. But maybe there's things to be rethinking about the whole areas of logistics, which the pandemic is now making us think rather differently about.
Yeah, and that's what I think. I think too. I think those paradigms are coming down, right? So coming from the gig economy and last mile delivery, I mean, even when I started that business, it was, how are we going to do this at scale in a meaningful way that yields quality results with independent drivers? For me, that was why I was there. We proved that thesis. And I think that way of thinking, highly digital, highly technologically driven, but independent owner operators have very creative resolutions to big problems. And I think it's the power of people that are decentralized under, some form of technology. I don't want to say governance, but allowing people to invest their own intellectual capital into the solution, as opposed to running everything through the same process. I think there's something there. I think it takes creative thinking. It takes a great deal of technology to maintain control. But I think the future is about that cross-functional aspect of business that we just can't seem to get at. I work in this department and you work in that department, and I own this process and you own this little bit of the process, but no one owns the process. Technology lets us look and own the process, and then letting people have the ability to be creative within their own autonomy, down to the lowest level of my truck, my gas, let me get to what I need to get to, and I'll show you how I can make a living. Stop trying to control me, let technology do another role. And I think there's lots of possibilities in there, but I think there's at times really big 180 thinking, and then I think there's different iterations that we've been going through lately.
Disruption versus opportunity.
I think Jim has his hand up.
Yeah, just adding to the conversation. I think chaos is the bigger brother of risk. So we're always going to have chaos, and we're always going to have risk. It's measuring how much it is compared to what industry or SME may be, or the giant corporation. But if you take those problems and turn them into challenges, then you can start strategizing. So I'm just talking basic framework, start strategizing what we can do, because you can't solve everything. Even production, you never want production to be 100%. So you'll always have a percentage that you want to try to attain, and then try to shoot for that goal. Again, never 100%. For example, when we talk about e-commerce, the And it's, as we all know, it's going to get real bad real soon, more so because we're getting the Christmas season coming on. And what's going to be happening is that, Chris, your business is going to boom. I don't know if it's going to be before Christmas or after Christmas, probably after Christmas, eh? I guess you'd be working Boxing Day.
Yeah.
But part of what you see there is that how can we have a new normal, and that's still being redefined, but still segments or rudiments of our past normal is still there. The customer experience of being in the retail store, for example. What I've been impressed with is that some retail outlets out there actually customer into, if they want to buy a new jacket, for example, they can turn around and the technology is there to put them into that jacket so they can do a 3D version, walk around and see that. My wife, I'm just checking to see if she's here. My wife, when she's looking at flooring, she can turn around and take a picture of our living room, and then the flooring will come into it, so she'll see that. So what that's doing is minimizing the risk of returns, satisfying the customer. So they're thinking outside the box. If the customer can't come to the store, let's bring the store to them. So the critical thinking aspect that we have is that it's that thinking out of the box. How else can we improve it? Because it's not so much our generation, we're all young people, but it's our kids that are growing up in the circumstance that just they want it now, they can get it now. So we've got to come up with ways to sort of meet that. And I think Gary is right, because we're thinking we've got to think more of the longer term and build a way up to it, because as you take steps, you're going to find out some steps are going to be brittle and you got to go a different way. But at least you've got the goal in mind that it's the future one that we're having. That future of my kids, for example, is not that far away. They're starting to earn income when they're teenagers and they're turning around, and so Amazon, they don't have to go to stores, bang, it's there in 2 days or a day, depending on where you are and a Prime member. But I think it just comes back to the aspect that we have to be candidates for change. Change brings a challenge. We cannot be of the aspect of, hey, we're the biggest company going and no one's going to harm us. Well, we look at Sears, we look at American Motors, and you keep going down that line. Size means nothing. I remember working for a firm called Consumers Distributing. Does that ring a bell to anyone?
I worked there. Yeah.
So did I. And
That was my first job, picking in that warehouse.
and they were doing
Coming
the
out.
future. They were actually doing the future.
They were.
But just didn't keep up with what was going on, because now look at what's happening. Us, the Joe and Jill consumer, we're doing all the input for the orders, right? At Consumers, they're doing the same thing, except it was, of course, on paper. So it was mainly a micro warehouse that they had there, and they're ordering there.
Exactly.
And hopefully you had everything that they were looking for. But it's that type of thing. They're so advanced, but they didn't see it. They took it all in one chunk, in my mind. And if they would have done steps to it, they would have been the Amazon of today, potentially.
Yeah, but the to your point, Jim, there's so many glimpses of this. Even Sears Canada and its distribution network here could have been the next Amazon. They just didn't spot it.
Yeah.
The whole probably business world is a whole litany of missed opportunities. That somebody did something and got halfway there, but they just didn't do that next piece to actually cement that advantage. They didn't understand the route to competitive advantage. They were thinking too tactically.
And
But I think that-
also that as you point towards that, you have to have education with that, because they're so far advanced. As we look back and see this, they're so far advanced, but they had to educate the people. This is the way to do it. And then with that education come along, because to spring a new idea on somebody, you're going to have the RC factor. We talk about it in business, but it happens with consumers too. They still have that RC factor. Now, the big splash came with the pandemic. All of a sudden, we didn't have a choice. Either you ordered things online or you didn't order, because you couldn't go to the stores. So that was a game changer, the meteorite hitting the earth type of thing. But in normal phrase of business, it is a slow change depending on what it is. Fashion is a good example of how things can change rapidly. If you take some, using them as an example, because every season they have new products coming out and they have to think about these products, what, a year ahead of time in order to design, produce, get it going. So they're the forward thinkers. Maybe that's an example we should be taking a look at, is how that changes. Because if that particular item doesn't sell, or that style, or those colors don't change.
Apparel is really interesting because we have this inbuilt waste in this supply chain design and the ultimate sales, because when we do our assortment planning, we actually say, oh, we're going to mark down this much and then clear the rest, and then that becomes the assortment plan, basically our operating model for that season. When it comes over, and it's all about, oh, did we clear that much, or did we clear more? Well, the answer is, surely, if you want to have good margins, is you just buy in what you need. I know that sounds, to any person in the apparel industry, go, you just don't understand my world, Gary. Well, that's the idea. I don't understand you. I don't want to subscribe to it. I want you to think differently. How could we solve this? And then you look at Zara, and then we've got a great example of Zara. Who, you know, I'm walking, not me myself, I won't walk into a ladies department, but many ladies do. And they say, well, like, could you come over here? I really like this, but I like it in orange. And I like it with a slightly different cut. Comes writing it down, puts it into the design office. 2 weeks later, it's on the floor in that store. How is that possible? When I'm a normal apparel, you know, the Reitmans of the world, here's my 9 months worth of orders, you know, bring it over when you can, please. And hopefully you got it about right. And I'm into markdowns and stuff like that. You don't see too many, and please correct me if I'm wrong with anybody who buys regularly from Zara. You don't see many markdowns. They don't run markdown campaigns because they've eliminated waste at source. So they buy in the material, and they buy lots of dye. I was going to say paint, but dye. And they have these tanks, and they go, what do we need? Right, okay. Pull off this white, effectively white cotton, run it through the dye, cut it to shape, and get it out. Whereas, you know, when we think about, and you know, I'm more than happy to have other people comment on this, because I've been saying for a long, long time, our retail supply chains, which are geographically extended and defined as just in time, are completely the opposite of what the whole concept of just in time is all about, which is things like single piece processing and responding to actual demand, not forecasted demand. So I don't know where the term just in time came from and applied to retail, but it shows you every attribute of not being just in time. And our excuse why we're so disrupted now is because lean only works in steady state. No, it doesn't. It's very allied to agility. In the design of a just-in-time system, you could almost say lean or agility, almost interchangeable in that context. But when we've got 6,000 miles, I think the number is 23, 27 days in normal circumstances, that can hardly be seen to be just in time. You have these drips of stuff coming over, network into your DC, out to stores. You might actually say we're responding to demand. No, you're not. You're responding to a forecast somebody in head office has dreamt up, and everybody's hoping now. They're sitting on the edge of their seats and saying, are we going to deliver what we set out to deliver? Oh no, we have to run markdown programs. Oops, this one has to go to clearance. Oh, this one has to end up in the bin. It's one of the most inefficient supply chains that exist in retailing. The only other one that's comparable is food.
Well, in honor of Captain Kirk, they brought us the term replicator. Modernizing that term, we call it a 3D printer.
Yeah.
So that could be the next, I don't know if you call it evolution or revolution that's coming down, because the cost of those are coming down. There's factories that are set up that are nothing but 3D printers producing parts for the auto industry, for example. So when you talk about just in time, that's what sparked my interest there. This is the closest you're going to get at just in time, is that going to be made to order, because the consumer will wait for a car. If they can't buy a car off the lot because they want a certain option or something on there, they're willing to wait. So that's already instilled in them. It's just that the competition says, you don't have to wait, we have it here. But as someone's being the innovator, the pioneer, that's saying, well, if you can wait 2 hours, come back, we'll have that dress in that style for you, or we'll have this made for you, that type of thing. As the speed of 3D printers quadruple from where they are now to produce it. But that could be the next thing that's you're looking at, and how to be a part of that. And look at all the cost savings that has. One printer versus a warehouse. Okay. that goes on. So that's something I haven't heard a lot of people talk about, but I see it creeping in the big areas. And again, I use the automotive industry where they're doing, companies are 3D printing instead of using the earth minerals, for example.
I'm seeing it more and more as well. It's 8:30 and we just had a whole group of people drop off.
Okay.
So to the pub, first round's on me.
Oh, right, I'm there.
Okay.
Perfect. Let's go, Jimmy Pace. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for listening today. I hope the information has been valuable for you and your team. You can connect with me via the website retail.ca and go to the contact page, or via LinkedIn by typing linkedin.com/in/last-mile. Look forward to hearing from you and playing an active part with your supply chain and your business's transformation as you start to act boldly, think big, scale, adapt, and win.